Welcome, everyone. I am Archie Wright, the Executive Director of the Catholic Biblical Association, and I want to welcome everyone to the CBA Unbound Book Review panel discussion on the new book by James Barker, Writing and Rewriting the Gospels, John and the Synoptics, which was recently published by Eerdmans in, I believe, January of 2025. So I first want to introduce our um, panelists for our discussion today. First is Daniel Frayer-Griggs, who is the Visiting Assistant Professor of Biblical Studies and Interim Director of the Rosen Writing Center and Learning Support at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. His academic interests include the historical Jesus, the Gospels, and Second Temple Judaism. Yay! Daniel is a fellow Durham PH graduate. Yay again, and so it's a special honor to have him here today. He has published Saved Through the Fire, The Fiery Ordeal in New Testament Eschatology by Pickwick in 2016. He is also a co-editor of To Recover What Has Been Lost, Essays on Eschatology, Intertextuality, and Reception History in honor of Dale C. Allison, published by Brill in 2020. He has published numerous journal articles in HDR, JBL, NTS, and the Journal for the Study of Historical Jesus, and several essays in edited volumes. So welcome, Daniel. Um, Zach Eberhart is Assistant Professor of Biblical Studies at Point University. He holds a THM from Columbia Theological Seminary, an MA in religion from the University of Georgia, and earned his PhD in New Testament and early Christianity from Loyola University in Chicago in 2023. His recent work is Between Script and Scripture, Performance Criticism and Characterization of the Disciples, published by Brill in 2024. So welcome, Zach. It's good to have you here. And third, Hugo Méndez is Associate Professor of Ancient Mediterranean Religions at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Hugo earned his MA in Religion from the University of Georgia in 2009 and his PhD also from Georgia in 2013 in linguistics. His areas of interest are the Gospel and the Epistles of John, Luke and Acts, and ritual uses of biblical texts, among many other things. Hugo's recent publications include The Gospel of John, A New History by Oxford University Press in 2025. He is also co-authored, with Bart Ehrman, The New Testament, A Historical Introduction to the Early Christian Writings, also by OUP in 2024, and The Cult of Stephen in Jerusalem, Inventing a Patron Martyr by OUP in 2022. And the author of the volume that we're going to be discussing today is James Barker. He is the Associate Professor of New Testament at Western Kentucky University. He earned his Master's of Theological Studies from Vanderbilt Divinity School and his PhD in New Testament and Early Christianity from Vanderbilt University in 2011, entitled John's Use of Matthew, supervised by A.J. Levine, and later published by Fortress Press in 2015. James' primary interests include New Testament and early Christianity, ancient writing materials and processes, interrelations of the Gospels. His second book is Tatian's Diastesaron, Compositions, Redaction, Recension, and Reception in the Oxford Early Christian Studies by OUP in 2021. And of course, the volume we are discussing today is Writing and Rewriting the Gospels, John and the Synoptics by Eerdmans, published in 2025. So James and panel, it is a pleasure to have you here today. So I'm going to turn it over to James to have him briefly introduce him to his book, and then we will proceed then with our panelists. And after they have presented their reviews and discussions. We will take a short break at that point, and then we'll return with James to offer his responses to those reviews. So, James, I turn it over to you for your introduction. Great to have you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much, Archie, for that introduction. Thanks to Dan and Hugo and Zach for responding. I eagerly anticipate our discussion today, and thanks especially to Joshua for putting all this together and all the behind the scenes work that's gone into it. It really is an honor to be here. And the CBA in general has been such an important venue for me. When I was studying with AJ Levine at Vanderbilt, she spoke so highly of CBA and particularly how unpretentious the meetings are and how you actually get to know people and sit and eat together and have a lot of great conversations. And then also the an aspect of the CBA of having these continuing seminars, and the one on Johannine literature has just been a home for me throughout the time I was writing this book, writing and rewriting the Gospels, John and the Synoptics. I had finished writing about John's use of Matthew, which at the time, well, it still is the only book devoted to the subject. There had been a few articles, and you had famous quotes like Rudolf Schnackenberg saying, "Special connections between John and Matthew are rare and unimportant," and very easily dismissed the idea that there was any connection between John and Matthew, which made it a really good topic for a dissertation so many years ago. But in the course of writing that, I, of course, had to stay on task and write about John and Matthew. But everywhere I looked, I could just see these traces of Mark and big shadows of Luke, and I knew that I wanted to pursue that at a later date as a follow up, and was finally able to do that. Archie mentioned that I wrote a book about the Diatessaron, and that was originally just going to be an article that I wanted to be able to cite in this book to say things like, well, you know, Greg Carey has this famous article that's not cited nearly enough. I cite it as much as I could, and everyone else should too, called Moving Things Ahead as a Lucan redactional technique. I mean, everybody knows the anointing of Jesus that in Matthew, Mark, and John is right before the Passion. In connection to the Passion, Jesus explicitly says, "This is preparation for my burial." And Luke moves that so far ahead in the narrative that it happens so early. And it's just something that Luke does. And people tend to think, or there's been a lot of scholarship written about how the synoptics themselves, you know, it would be very difficult for them to be reordering their sources and reshuffling the deck, so to speak. Like how would you even do that? So for me, I turned to ancient writing materials and I just made my own arts and crafts of, okay, well, this is what a Roman era wax tablet looked like, and this is how people for more than 1,000 years drafted literary works, and they did write on scrolls and book rolls. You know, this is the Gospel of John in book roll form, and that's what they did for again, for more than 1,000 years before anybody had the technology to make a codex, you know, one like this. Here is the Gospel of John in codex form. So I spent a whole lot of time learning how ancient writing materials actually worked. And the more I did that, the easier it became to see how people could rewrite things and reorder things at will. And so Tatian does this. He takes something where Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell the same story in exactly the same order, and Tatian will grab something from Luke and shove it in where it doesn't go in any order of any other gospels, and he creates his own unique narrative sequence. So I wanted to be able to cite that to say one of the knocks on John has been that he uses so little of the synoptic material that we should just think of John as an independent gospel, even if you had some vague awareness that there were other gospels out there. Um, but that incident in the temple, the one that leads to Jesus getting arrested and killed in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, John says that happened 2 years before Jesus's death. So how and why would someone move something ahead? And I just look back to Luke, who frequently moves things way ahead in the narrative, and I look at Tatian, who rearranges things. And so I modeled this to say you could work with multiple manuscripts simultaneously. You could do that as an individual. You could do that in a group. In terms of ancient writing practices, there's nothing difficult about that. And we shouldn't hold it against John that he takes some of his synoptic stuff and he moves it around. So that was the writing part of the Gospels. The rewriting part is to say when we look at John, we have to take seriously the phenomenon of rewriting as a literary technique in Second Temple Judaism and in Greco-Roman literature, that people would take a story, a well-known story, and they would still rewrite it and they would recast it. And I always go to Virgil's Aeneid, which we know is imitating Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. But the scene when Odysseus, in Homer's version, goes to Hades and doesn't know that his mother has died, he encounters her and tries to hug her 3 times, but she's a ghost because she's in Hades and she's dead. And so Virgil takes that same motif, but it's not Aeneas's mother; it's Aeneas's father. That 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 had just been seen moments before, and he's dead, and the 3 times tried to hug, but he can't because he's a ghost, and then yet again encounters him later in the underworld. We can see that episode being doubled. We can see the characters being recast, but there's no question it's an imitation. And so we have to grant that this was a thing that people were doing, that it was not uncommon, and that John can recast characters as he sees fit. He can reorder the gospel stories as he sees fit. And none of this means we need to appeal to oral tradition for the differences we see in John, which has been a common move to make throughout the 20th century, is to say, well, when John has something synoptish, it's because he heard a different version of it. And I say, no, it's just because John chose to rewrite it. And if you look back at the Synoptics, you see the same thing. In Matthew and Mark, Jesus curses a fig tree. Luke seems not to like that. So he recasts it into a parable where a landowner wants to have a fig tree cut down, but the gardener convinces him, give it another year, give it time. And so what happens is a real thing. It's recast as a parable in the Gospel of Luke. And we take away this mean Jesus who curses an unsuspecting fig tree in Jerusalem. So I think that there's plenty of rewriting going on in the synoptics themselves if we look closely. So to see John rewriting, it's a difference of degree, not of kind. And so he rewrites to a fuller extent. He gives you a 2 year ministry of Jesus with 3 Passovers, encompassing two full calendar years. He changes what happens when and where. He leaves large gaps in the narrative, months at a time. But when you go back and read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're not at all interested in telling you the chronology of Jesus's ministry. You have absolutely no idea how long it lasts. So we can see John improving upon these works, but that is not to say that John wanted to replace the Synoptic Gospels, which is yet another move that we've seen throughout the 20th century, that John wrote a gospel, and if he did know the Synoptics, he didn't like them. He wanted to replace them. He wanted his to be the one and only gospel. And I find that notion completely untenable given everything we know about ancient reading and writing practices. I could point over my left shoulder to my row of commentaries. I've got 4 commentaries, multi-volume commentaries on Matthew, 3 on Mark, 3 on Luke, and I don't know, 5 or so of John. I don't just have one, even if I do have my favorites. I have multiple copies of very similar works, and I compare them very closely. And that's what an ancient author would do. They would know their sources and they would study them carefully, whether as an individual or in a group scenario. Either is equally plausible, and you would come up with a new gospel. And I think Mark Goodacre's new book is phenomenal at showing that John is a lot more synoptic than we have led ourselves to believe. So I won't step on still any of his material there, but I will give a plug for his book, The Fourth Synoptic Gospel. I think he's exactly right about that. But when John is different, we need to just let John be different and recognize that it's not anything we don't see Tatian doing with the four gospels. It's nothing we don't see Josephus doing with Samuel Kings and Chronicles in Hebrew and Greek, knowing what came before and using bits of all of it, but that doesn't stop him from rewriting some episodes in a new way. And so the more we put the Gospels in a much broader context, be it Second Temple Judaism or Greco-Roman literature, the more John makes sense, and the more sense it makes to say he had his sources. He worked from them, he took from them what he wanted, and he recast things as he saw fit. And that's the way you wrote a book. The Synoptics had kind of gotten played out, and Moody Smith, my Dr. Grossvater, A.J. Levine's dissertation advisor at Duke, he famously asked in an essay, is John the first apocryphal gospel? Should we think of John as making this kind of turn to where you've heard these stories played out now in three gospels, and so now I need to tell you something you don't know. And that's why so little of John is paralleled in the Synoptics. If we look at the Gospel of Thomas, half of it you know from the Synoptics, half of it you don't. Because I need to give you something you're familiar with so that you're locked in and you're into Jesus books and you're going to be a collector. But to have mine in addition to those others, I need to tell you some stuff you don't know. That's what I see John doing, and that's where the rewriting comes in. But again, what John's doing is not something that's new. It's already there in the Synoptics if we look for it. And so what I found are these snowballing trajectories that go from Mark to Matthew to Luke to John, and that gives you, with no hypothetical sources, with no hypothetical compositional stages of any of these gospels. We just go from Mark to Matthew to Luke to John, with every successive author having everything that came before, and we can explain everything that we have. That's the thesis of my book, and I'm eager to hear, particularly with this trajectories approach, how it's received. So thanks again for having me, and turn things over to reviewers.
James, thanks so much. That was a great introduction, and I'm sure it's going to stir some great conversation. And I believe we're going to turn to Dan now for his comments. And Dan, turn it over to you now. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Archie and Joshua, for the invitation to be here. And let me first begin by offering my congratulations to Dr. Barker on the publication of Writing and Rewriting the Gospels. It's a book that I not only learned much from, but one I deeply enjoyed reading. The writing is clear and engaging. The pop culture references scattered throughout are not only entertaining, but often illuminating. And the argument is timely, as many in the field are now re-evaluating long-held beliefs and assumptions regarding the relationships between the Gospels, particularly between John and the Synoptics. Although it's not on our list of topics to discuss, I found the opening chapter on how to write a Gospel particularly compelling, and I was glad to see some props here shared by James. The hands-on experiments Barker describes in that chapter, which include creating his own scroll of the Gospel of John, constructing his own wax tablets, are fascinating, not only because they sound like fun and interesting projects, which they do, but especially because Barker is able to point to them as concrete evidence that an ancient author could have moved with relative ease from one section of a source scroll to another while composing. I think every student of the Gospels would benefit from reading this chapter. I turn now to the first topic of today's conversation, namely the advantages and or disadvantages of, quote, snowballing trajectories, according to which each gospel is familiar with and creatively engages every preceding gospel. Since this concept is central to chapters 2 and 3 of the book and to our conversation today, and since some of our conference participants may not have read the book yet, one extended example is warranted. Consider the figure of Judas, whom Barker calls a, quote, classic Johannine snowman. Judas appears in all 4 canonical Gospels, and Barker traces how his role evolves across them. In Mark, Judas is first identified as the one who would betray Jesus, 3:19, and is not mentioned again until he does so in 14:10. Importantly, Judas's betrayal is not motivated by money in Mark. Rather, the payment is offered only after the betrayal. Matthew follows Mark's general portrayal, but flips things around by presenting the 30 pieces of silver as motivation for the betrayal. Luke similarly has the chief priests and temple officers agree to pay Judas in advance, but introduces a new element with Satan's entrance into Judas, thereby linking the betrayal to demonic possession. In John, these themes converge. As in Matthew, Judas is portrayed as motivated by money. For in John's account of the anointing scene, it is he, Judas, who complains about the cost of the perfume. And he is described as a thief who regularly pilfered from the communal purse. By contrast, Mark's complaint about the costly perfume was voiced by an anonymous character, and Matthew attributed it to an unnamed disciple. And following Luke, John's Judas is associated with demonic influence, when Jesus deems him, quote, a devil in 670 and 71, and Satan enters him before the betrayal in 13:27. So one considerable strength of Barker's concept of snowballing trajectories is its accessibility to a broad array of readers. In his previous work, John's Use of Matthew, he focused on identifying evidence of Matthean redaction in the Gospel of John. This methodological approach was rigorously applied to a handful of parallels discussed at length and in great detail. Such technical arguments may be more likely to sway fellow academics, but they're unlikely to reach a broader audience. Here, Barker makes his case for that larger readership. And the image of snowballing trajectories is a compelling one to help convey that message. This strength is compounded by the sheer number of trajectories that Barker discusses and points us to in both chapter 2 and chapter 3. Another strength of Barker's approach is his recognition of the gospel writers as possessing authorial agency. As he ably demonstrates in the first chapter, creatively engaging and rewriting previously written sources was a hallmark of texts as diverse as Virgil's Aeneid, mentioned already, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, the intertestamental Book of Jubilees, Josephus's Antiquities, the apocryphal Acts of Thomas, and many more. As rewriters of prior texts, the evangelists stand in a well-established and honorable literary tradition. And once we recognize the prevalence of creative rewriting in literary circles, that Matthew, Luke, and John all participated in this practice may be seen as more plausible. Regarding potential disadvantages, I'll link this to the next question. To what extent does Barker's approach challenge the prevailing two-source hypothesis and the necessity of Q? This is kind of a loaded question, given that Barker explicitly states the main purpose of chapter 2 is to reject the Q hypothesis and defend the Farrer hypothesis. Incidentally, it's worth noting that a good number of the most prominent Q skeptics also hold that John was familiar with the Synoptics. Alongside Barker, Mark Goodacre and Francis Watson come immediately to mind as obvious examples of this alignment. And there may seem to be a logic to this correlation. If we're willing to grant Johannine creativity with source material, should we not acknowledge that other gospel writers could exercise the same license and vice versa? I must confess, however, that while I have grown increasingly convinced of John's familiarity with the Synoptics, I remain a Q holdout. These previously held convictions to Johannine familiarity and the Synoptics, familiarity with the Synoptics, and the Q hypothesis inevitably shaped my perception of Barker's contribution, with the result that I often found myself a bit more skeptical of his examples in the chapter on synoptic trajectories and more receptive to his arguments in the chapter on Johannine trajectories. For me, then, one of the disadvantages here to the snowballing trajectories is the notion that all of the evangelists possessed the same sort of authorial agency. And that is by imagining Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as all participating in the same sort of rewriting, we lose sight of their distinctives. If John knew the Synoptics, he clearly approached those texts with a greater degree of independence than Matthew and Luke had towards Mark, which enabled him to be rather consistent in his rewriting. Because John's verbatim use of the Synoptics is exceedingly rare throughout John, I'm more inclined to accept that he creatively rewrote those sources. But if Luke knew both Mark and Matthew, he was rather idiosyncratic in how he made use of Matthew, at times very faithfully copying, at other times radically departing. To be clear, my concern is not whether Luke could have navigated from passage to passage within a scroll of Matthew, but why he would have jumped back and forth in a way that, at least to my mind, seems so erratic. Nor is it with the question of whether Luke could have significantly rewritten his sources, but with why he would do so with such irregularity, again, particularly with regard to Matthew. So as someone who does not hold the Farrer hypothesis, I would have liked to see closer engagement with scholars who hold the Q hypothesis in Barker's treatment of each of his synoptic trajectories. This would have made a more compelling argument for those of us not already convinced. Relatedly, in emphasizing the significance of creative rewriting, Barker leaves aside serious consideration of any sort of oral tradition, which might explain some of the similarities between Matthew and Luke. Are appeals to oral tradition too often speculative and too easily invoked? Yes, point taken. But did oral traditions exist alongside written sources? Inevitably, yes. So while I understand that Barker is making a case for a paradigm shift, I felt he dismissed these options too quickly, and at times it felt as though he was writing for a readership already convinced of the Farrer hypothesis. Moving to the next question. How do notions of rewriting in general and oppositio in imitando in particular reshape our understanding of Johannine creativity and intention? I should begin by saying that I find this concept, oppositio in imitando or opposition in imitation, very attractive, and I have begun to employ it in some of my own research. I'm grateful to Dr. Barker for introducing me to this concept through his scholarship. Some brief examples may illustrate the phenomenon for our online viewers. Jesus's rhetorical question in John 18:11, "Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me?" seems like a critical reaction to Mark 14:36. Where Jesus prays, "Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me." Similarly, John's insistence that Jesus carried his own cross may plausibly be seen as intentionally imitating while opposing the synoptic tradition that he relied on Simon of Cyrene to carry it for him. These traditions are obviously related, yet John contradicts what came before. As I noted earlier, partly due to my prior conviction that John knew the synoptics, I found myself more receptive to Barker's arguments in chapter 3. I've already mentioned the case of Judas, but another example of this intrigued me, and that's the answering of the Samaritan question. In Barker's reading, we move from Mark's Jesus, who takes an inconvenient route around Samaria on his way from Galilee to Jerusalem, to Matthew's Jesus, who explicitly tells his disciples to go nowhere among the Samaritans, to Luke's Jesus, who visits the Samaritan city but is rejected, but still goes on to say good things about the Good Samaritan and the Samaritan leper. And then finally to John's Jesus, who finds a hearing and followers in Sychar of Samaria. To my mind, this seems very interesting, very possible, but at the same time, somewhat suggestive. And so while I do think John knows these Gospels, I'd like to see some more detailed evidence to support this particular case. I think one point where James does this well is that he actually links Matthew and John's use of the harvest saying to show some correlation between these traditions. But one critique that's sometimes leveled against the assumption of the common oral tradition behind material common to John and the Synoptics is that it's too easily invoked, as I mentioned before. And it's the explanation for all similarities. So it becomes a sort of panacea for all that ails the thesis of Johannine independence. And I think there's merit to this critique, but some critics might also make a similar accusation against creative rewriting in general and oppositio in imitando as the explanation for all differences. Barker himself even concedes he may be accused of trying to have it both ways. Heads I win, tails you lose. Given this potential critique, I'd like to ask, what are the controls on this sort of endeavor? And I wish to be clear here, I raise this question as one who accepts creative rewriting, that it does take place among the Gospels, and as one who finds the concept of oppositio in imitando to have great potential. So my interest here is in refining the approach. And I wonder if Dr. Barker has further thoughts on what criteria might be employed to help verify these sorts of suggestions. Perhaps this would mean a return to Barker's more rigorous search for redactional elements from one gospel appearing in another, or perhaps it would mean a turn to something akin to Richard Hayes's criteria for identifying intertextual allusions and echoes, which include availability, volume, recurrence, thematic coherence, historical plausibility, history of interpretation, and satisfaction. I suspect that part of the problem I'm naming here may be the flip side of the strength that I noted above, namely that the present contribution is meant to appeal to a broad readership and therefore intentionally avoids getting into the weeds of detailed argumentation. So I raise this question with the recognition that a book can't be all things to all people. When it comes to our final question regarding John's theological reframing of the Synoptics and how it might, quote, shape the interpretive approaches of preachers, theologians, and lay readers, end quote, I will keep my remarks brief. The obvious answer is, well, it depends. Some who are more beholden to literal readings of the Bible will, in all probability, continue to insist on harmonizing the Gospels. Yet those who are open to a view of the evangelists as exercising varying degrees of creativity in their writing and rewriting may find an invitation to follow in their footsteps, viewing the evangelists as models of faithful imagination and thus finding encouragement to engage in their own acts of creative storytelling. If the Gospels themselves are dynamic in their telling and retelling of the story of Jesus, presenting him anew for readers in different contexts, perhaps pastors and theologians can and should do the same. Preaching and teaching in the church has always been contextual, and a recognition that the Gospels engage in the task of theological imagination are not just historical accounts of the past may provide a model for those struggling with questions of how the Christian faith might remain relevant to our contemporary questions and concerns. So allow me to conclude my comments here by underscoring my deep appreciation of Dr. Barker's contribution. This is an exciting moment in Johannine studies. Barker's work has stirred the waters of gospel scholarship and will certainly help many enter into the conversation. This work, along with recent contributions by Hugo Méndez, Mark Goodacre, and others, is sure to stimulate much fresh thinking, and I look forward to seeing where the conversation goes, both here today and in the coming years of scholarship on the fourth gospel. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. That has given us all a lot to think about, and I'm sure James has a lot to think about from that. We're now going to turn to Hugo for his comments. So Hugo, I turn it over to you now. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. I just want to start by saying it is an absolute pleasure for me to be on this panel today. James Barker's writing and rewriting the Gospels is one of the most important books on the Gospels to come out in years. And I strongly, strongly recommend that everyone watching this session pick up a copy. About a year ago, Eerdmans reached out to me asking me to consider writing a blurb for the book. And by the time I was done reading it, I was thrilled to write a ringing endorsement. As I wrote then, and as I'm going to repeat now, writing and rewriting the Gospels isn't so much a study as a revelation, a convincing glimpse into the hidden processes behind the creation of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. As Dan noted, there are a few questions that are going to be guiding our discussion, I think especially in the second hour. Among them, what are the advantages and disadvantages of Barker's snowballing trajectory model? And for those who are tuning in, this is precisely the idea that Mark comes first, influences Matthew, both of which influence Luke, all of which influence John. There's also the question of how does John's theological reframing, for example, Christology, alter or deepen the meaning of the themes common to the Synoptics. In my initial brief comments on this panel, however, I want to not focus on these questions that will occupy so much of our time, but instead, and again, especially thinking about an audience that might not yet have read Barker's book, I want to spotlight two of the many important contributions of Barker's book, the particular emphases and insights that I think set it apart from any other work on the market. And I want to be sure that these two are foregrounded when we think about the merits and achievement of this particular text. To begin, I think the first and most profound step forward in this book is its attention to the materialities of gospel writing. And Dan already alluded to this point at the beginning of his comments. There are many ways that one could begin writing a book called Writing and Rewriting the Gospels. Barker, in his first chapter, decides to begin his study by asking a surprisingly practical question. How would someone in the first century go about writing a gospel? What did this writing process look like? It's a surprising question only because so few scholars have ever bothered to explore it in this sort of detail. Other scholars have written books on the development of the Gospels, but few of those studies explore how, practically, one wrote longer narratives in the ancient world. Because of this, as Barker capably demonstrates, those same studies are often littered with all sorts of incorrect assumptions about this process, assumptions that color their understanding of the gospel tradition and of gospels as a whole. This is where Barker's voice is so refreshing and so necessary. Barker has been a cutting-edge voice on the materialities of gospel writing. And more importantly, he's one of the few researchers in our field to have practical, hands-on experience working with the relevant media and technologies dating back to an NEH Summer Institute and with years and years of experience exploring these technologies with students at Western Kentucky University. And so, in his first chapter, Barker introduces his readers to the tools and techniques of the ancient scribes who composed the Gospels, the single frame wax tablets, the polytichs, the papyrus rolls, and the early codices. Barker expertly canvasses classical literature to explain how these technologies were used, and he draws from his experience working with them to bust many misconceptions about their use. The result is a chapter that I think is absolutely brilliant. It's written in an accessible, crisp, and engaging style. It is pitched at a perfect, even ideal level for an undergraduate classroom. But don't be fooled. This is also one of the most remarkable and robust scholarly discussions of gospel writing that is available to any specialist in the field. It is, I think, a must-read for scholars and students alike, and I would dare say that this first chapter is worth the entire price of the book, especially for the ways that it sets up so much of Barker's later interventions. Uniting all his insights and experience, Barker shows, for example, that the gospel authors typically would have written in multiple stages, that the gospel writers usually maintained visual contact with their source texts as they were writing and rewriting their own texts. And he shows that those writers were more than capable of managing multiple source texts simultaneously. And in this way, he demonstrates how the gospel authors could have been more fluid in borrowing, adapting, and rewriting source materials than many existing source critical models allow. Barker's text then challenges us to take decidedly a material turn in our study of gospel origins and to think deeply about the gospels as material objects. But I'd also like to highlight a second signal contribution of this text. And then as we're talking about John's relationship with the Synoptics, I don't want to miss this. Many books currently on the market explore the subtle and complex interrelationships between the Gospels as Barker does. But what makes Barker's text distinct, and I think uniquely valuable, is that it is one of the first major studies of the 21st century to expressly relate the practice of gospel writing and the gospel tradition as a whole to the Pauline literature. Across the text, Barker uncovers numerous links between the emerging gospel tradition and the flowering body of Pauline, Deutero-Pauline, Pseudo-Pauline texts in the late 1st and early 2nd century. In other words, the snowballing trajectory that Barker locates for Gospels starts actually somewhere in the Himalayas that are Paul. As he playfully summarizes these links on page 150, quote, Mark, in his view, is Pauline, Matthew is anti-Pauline, Luke attempts a synthesis, and in a sense, John is Deutero-Pauline. Obviously, this is the barest summary. I will leave it to you all to mine this book for the many surprising insights and connections he draws between these bodies of literature. But the evidence he collects, I think, is strong and persuasive. I'm rather sympathetic to this evidence, mind you. I'm one of several people. I'm thinking also, here Michael Gorman, people who have been thinking a little synthetically about John and Paul's relationship. But Barker's work is blazing really important paths in this area, especially in the mapping of John's Christology against creator Christologies of works such as Ephesians and Hebrews. And this is something that I think we need to also be thinking very deeply about in any discussion of a snowballing model that Barker brings out today. And this brings me, by the way, once again, to the great achievement of Barker's book. It's true on the one hand that Barker's book puts a punctuation mark on what has been a decade and a half of studies arguing for John's knowledge of the Synoptics. It sits beside other sorts of studies, for instance, Eerdmans, co-edited volume on John's transformation of Mark. I'm thinking here of Mark Goodacre's recent book on the fourth Synoptic Gospel, thinking about John in relation to the Synoptics. But Barker's book is not a period. It is not a summary, coda, or closure. It is a comma. What's exciting about this book is that it opens up as many new horizons as it looks back towards. In weaving a sustained interest in John's connections to Paul, Barker, I think, anticipates and even ignites the next wave of major research in Johannine studies. If you are a scholar, teacher, or student wanting not only to sit at the cutting edge of scholarship in the Gospels, but also to anticipate future developments, I recommend Barker's book as a sure guide. This is a fantastic study. Now, again, my time is limited here. I can't detail the many other signal achievements of this book. For instance, Barker's deft defense, I think, of the Farrer hypothesis, the innovative connections Barker draws between John and the Synoptics, and James's provocative narrative of Christological developments in the Gospels. Instead, in the final moments of my initial remarks, I hope you'll indulge me as I ask James a few questions of my own, questions that I hope provoke deeper conversation in the minutes that follow. First, in your book, James, you discuss what you call the snowballing trajectory of the canonical Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. What your book leaves out, of course, are the many non-canonical, apocryphal, and/or Gnostic Gospels produced in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. No doubt you had to exclude them for space constraints. It's John 21 itself that reminds us there is no end to what one can say here in this gospel tradition. That being said, I'd love to hear your thoughts more about how you see these texts in relation to the snowballing trajectory that you discuss in your book. I'm taking that you understand Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John as the earliest Gospels written. Are there any others that you might consider placing in roughly the same period as the four? If these canonical Gospels are the earliest, how should we reflect on this fact? Perhaps as we think about, for instance, the reasons for their eventual canonization. I think these are questions that could help us also think about the importance of your work for teachers, pastors, priests, lay sort of engagement with this book. I'm also interested in how you think about your snowballing trajectory in light of what we see as a kind of fluid field of gospel writing in the 2nd century, with texts that seem to have features that evoke or might be derived from multiple gospels. I'm thinking of here, for instance, the Egerton gospel. How much fluidity do you imagine in the earliest gospel traditions, and how far does that fluidity potentially complicate the picture of a snowballing trajectory? Your thoughts on all of these questions would be great. My second question is interested a bit, not merely in the how or that of the Gospels, a Gospel of John's, for instance, use and reuse of the Synoptics, but the why as well. Across your book, James, I think you expertly demonstrate that John knew and adapted the Synoptics. I'm wondering if you could speak a little more on the subject of why John chooses to use as much of the Synoptics as he does and as little of the Synoptics as he does. Why, for instance, does John dramatically rewrite some episodes? Why does he leave at least a few, for instance, the feeding of the 5,000, relatively intact in their core story? I understand that, this would have to take us into specific episodes potentially, but is there anything broad we can say about this strategy? Why does John not participate in the dense verbatim copying we see in the Synoptics? I'm understanding that you're thinking that this gives John a certain amount of creative freedom, but can we see another sort of agenda at play? all of these kinds of questions are stirring in my mind after rereading this manuscript. I have many other questions. I think these two are enough. In closing, I'd like to congratulate Dr. Barker once again on a remarkable book. I think it's an achievement. It's a rich, engaging book to wrestle with, to teach with, and I very much intend to teach with it next semester, and to learn from. I could not recommend it more, and I'm excited to discuss it with not only my co-panelists, but all of you in the audience over the next hour. Thank you all so much.
Hugo, thank you so much. Some brilliant questions there, especially those last couple. So we now turn to Zach for his comments, and then we will take a short break after that. So Zach, I now turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Archie, and Hugo. Why do I have to follow you, right? It's hard to top, right? The cheerleading that was done by Hugo here. So I'm necessarily going to be the villain, I guess. But anyways, first of all, before I get too far in this, I want to thank Josh and Archie and CBA for the generous invitation to participate in this lively and I think important conversation. I'm going to echo my panelists' commendation of this book. I suspect that this volume will have a substantive impact on future configurations of the synoptics in general, but particularly, of course, John's relationship to the synoptics. And so because of this, I'm really honored by the opportunity to respond to it here. Before I begin, I must admit, when Josh reached out and asked if I would like to be a participant in this conversation, I couldn't help but wonder, perhaps there was a mistake, right? Despite the fact that I am currently in the early stages of writing a book on the synoptic problem, I admit I am by no means an expert in this arena. So much so that if you polled, anyone working on this problem right now, I'm unlikely to appear in anyone's top 100, right? So my logical conclusion was that others, more qualified, must have had fields or businesses that they needed to attend to, or some other excuses that necessitated their rejection of this invitation. And so when Josh messaged or compelled me, depending on one's preference for that story, I like those wandering around the streets, I quickly said yes without asking any questions. And now here I am sitting in front of you, right? I'm hoping that I'm wearing the proper robes for this invitation. Now you may be asking a number of questions right now, like why would I be beginning this sort of statement with a rewritten parable? And I'll come back to this in a bit. And you may also be asking, well, why, Zach, are you writing a book on the synoptic problem if you don't know anything about it? That's another great question, one I ask myself often these days. But part of this has to do with assumptions. And as a so-called proponent of performance criticism, many of the assumptions that get included in these attempts to tackle the synoptic problem, and I admit I'm still familiarizing myself with these specific arguments, so I'm painting with a bit of a broad brush here. But many of these assumptions which serve as foundation for these works, including James's here, I don't necessarily share those assumptions. And I think that's an important caveat to include here at the beginning of this statement. This is not to say that I think James and others are wrong. Rather, it's more humbly my attempt to name something that I noticed within the history of scholarship, and that is that the question of the interrelationships between the Gospels is, well, it's complex. Okay? And so thankfully, one of Barker's aims in writing this book, something that he reiterates on multiple occasions, is to remove some of the overly complicated and therefore unnecessary components which are featured in certain reconstructions of this problem. And in particular, he raises helpful questions about the necessity of hypothetical sources, right, such as Q, and the authority and power that are often vested to appeals to this, again, perhaps plausible but equally hypothetical oral traditions. Okay? And in both cases, I agree with Barker's impulse and even some of his critiques. And I think he is absolutely right to question the necessity of such hypothetical sources in our constructions of the synoptic problem. We don't need hypothetical sources to offer a plausible historical configuration because the relationships are there in the texts. But despite Barker's success in these two arenas, I can't help but wonder if a new problem arises. Okay. Barker goes to great lengths to simplify our understanding of the process of textual production in antiquity, and how modern reconstructions of that process are often based on unfound or unsupported technological assumptions about the past. And Hugo brought this up. It's a fantastic chapter that we do need to give to undergraduates. And I want to say that Barker does a great job of adding nuance to the conversations about ancient practices. Okay. But having said all that, I fear that the pendulum might have shifted too far to the other side, right? And perhaps this oversimplified media configuration, it results in a different kind of problem. Arguably less severe or obvious than the limitations of hypothetical sources, but problematic nonetheless if we are to properly attend to the interrelationships of the Gospels. Okay, so I share all of that, and I know this is a long introduction, but I share all that to say as both not only an overview of the book, but also as background, because my skepticism of certain textual assumptions are ultimately going to shape my following comments. Okay, and I'll do my best to distinguish between what I see are the merits of James's work in its own right, using its assumptions, which again, I'm going to reiterate are impressive given this particular framing. But I would also like us to consider whether James' helpful categories of snowballing and imitation might also allow us to think about the synoptic problem in more nuanced and ultimately less textualized ways than Barker has configured them here. Okay, so to the questions that we're responding to, and I recognize time is sort of running out, so most of my comment is first question, and we'll get to the other ones, I suspect, in conversations. But the first question we've been asked to respond to is to reflect upon the advantages and disadvantages of Barker's snowballing trajectory in light of the compositional practices in antiquity. In terms of the pros, I believe James's model of snowballing is helpful to explain some, and I'm going to emphasize here some of the trajectories we see within the Synoptics that eventually make it into John's rewriting of them. Now, my caveat of some here is not intended as a critique. Rather, I think it's a way of expressing what I think are James' own thoughts on this matter. That the snowballing trajectory is not intended as a catch-all for all of the discrepancies that we see within the Synoptics. And I think that if we assume that this category it fits all of these things, we're actually overlooking some of the nuance and helpful statements throughout this work that James includes. Okay, so in terms of pros, I do find the snowballing trajectory helpful for thinking about certain developments in the Synoptics. And you know, Dan and Hugo Dan did a really good job of sort of summarizing where you're seeing this. So I'm going to skip over some of these, but I find in particular, you know, I agree with Dan, right, that the Judas account kind of was somewhat convincing to me. I found that the John chapter was a little more convincing than the Synoptics themselves in seeing this. But I especially found your sort of a treatment of Luke, how he eliminates surprises and delays the parousia. I found those interesting and worth engaging with a little more here. Okay. More importantly, though, I actually find the snowballing model most persuasive in the final chapter about Christological developments among Christian writers, and we'll probably talk about that a little bit in it. In short, in terms of the snowballing trajectory and its pros, so long as we don't press the metaphor too far, I think snowballing can be a helpful way of seeing how the Farrer, Goodacre, Barker, whatever we're calling this model now, how this model can be helpful in thinking about what's happening in the Synoptics. The fact that Barker extends this into John, and he's not the first to do this, but it's another example of how it can be helpful to see this trajectory build up. So that all being said, I appreciate this and think this is helpful categorization. But I've also been asked to reflect on the disadvantages. And so I do think that James's configuration of snowballing has limits. And most obvious to me are the ways in which it's the particular media assumptions in which it's set. Okay, so for example, if we assume the direct textual relationship among the Synoptics, the snowballing trajectory, at least for me, becomes harder to maintain at a micro level. I think it still works at this macro level that you're talking about, but at a micro level, I think it becomes harder. When we use James' configuration of a textual relationship, if each text is available to each successive author, well, then every text must be considered in light of this notion of development, right? And there are certainly exceptions to this. I think, you know, Dan is probably mentioning this. the biggest example of this, right, is why does Luke break up Matthew's sermons, right? And James, I think you're right to say that other people are breaking these things up. It's not unique in antiquity to see this happen, but it does leave open this question that I don't know if the snowballing trajectory answers for us, why Luke breaks up these sermons, right? There are other examples we could go on with that, but that's sort of a big one for me, that it doesn't work at the snug level. But what is perhaps most interesting to me about this question, right, is that I think the snowballing trajectory might be more persuasive if we assume a not direct textual literary relationship between these sources. Now, I'm not saying this is oral traditions, but I do think that maybe, what if they don't have the text in front of them? How can that help explain snowballing trajectory? So an example of this, James cites the parable of the talents in Matthew and the minas in Luke. And this is also an example that Goodacre uses, I believe, in his earlier work on editorial fatigue. And so while fatigue may be one explanation, another could very well be that Luke knows a performance of Matthew and is paraphrasing, albeit in a different context, what he has heard that already exists in Matthew. We don't appeal to oral traditions, right, such as a pre-synoptic eschatological discourse that has several parables. Or we don't need to account for a second hypothetical source due to their similarities. The fact that the 280 words in Luke, only 50 of those have direct parallel with Matthew's 300-word account, we don't need an additional source because such a source isn't actually helpful in explaining its origin to us. Luke does not have to rewrite most of the text that he already has in Matthew because Luke has shifted the location by way of engagement, not by way of engagement with the text, but rather by way of recall of this parable. And this new context actually reflects the snowballing trajectory, one that challenges an earlier version or an earlier understanding of Jesus' parable related to this concept of the parousia. Okay, so while Barker has argued here for rewriting by Luke, and I think that's okay, I wonder if this rewriting necessitates a direct textual relationship. In other words, my question for James, and really for all of us on this panel, is it necessary for us to assume snowballing is a product of direct textual relationship? Can snowballing also be a product of performances? And how might a performance relationship, as opposed to a direct textual one, provide equally plausible explanations for these interrelations? Okay. To use one of my favorite examples from the book, James includes this echo and a well-timed reference to a work that exists as both text and film. And no, I'm not talking about his opening illustration of Pinocchio, nor his references to the Beatles or the mini legends of John Henry all the way through Jason Isbell, right? And James has really good taste, by the way, if that's not already clear. But of course, as the lowbrow stowaway on this panel who was wondering whether his clothes are the right ones or not for this event, I'm going to bypass these far more obvious and classic examples and go directly to the echo or allusion that spoke most clearly to me. On page 73, James makes a well-timed and helpful allusion to Fight Club, and he uses this to talk about a key textual feature of Luke. His subheading is titled Luke's Complete Lack of Surprise. And while the content of that chapter is actually really helpful, where he notes some of the numerous ways in which Luke's text eliminates potential surprises that a reader might encounter in Matthew and Mark. But it's the subheading here that I think is worth additional consideration for us. So as I was reading, admittedly, I almost shot coffee out of my mouth as this ref chuckle aloud reading. I don't know why I was surprised by this, but I don't know, it was an expected club reference in the middle of a synoptic problem. Yet it became a really foundational thing for me to think about while I was reading this rest of this book. You see, I knew immediately where the allusion came from, or at least I thought I did. See, despite my immediate recognition of that quote, the more I thought about it, it also became more complex. Because you see, the source exists as both a written and a performed version, from which James could be drawing upon either. And I realized that here in this book, we are met with an example of the very problem which the book is attempting to solve in the level of antiquity. Okay, so the original source, which is a novel written by Chuck Palahniuk, has the quote, Joe's complete lack of surprise. The performance, however, aka the film, has changed this to Jack's complete lack of surprise. Now, if this were Joe's complete lack of surprise, would James have thought the same echo? Would it still resonate at the same level because of the sound, right? Joe's sounds different than Luke's in the same way that Jack's might be sound similar to Luke's, okay? Now, don't get me wrong, conceptually, this is a very minor change about which there's little substantive difference in the terms of its takeaway, right? But I do think the sound matters here. You see, in both the novel and the performance, and I apologize for the spoiler alert if no one's seen Fight Club, but the line functions as a way for the narrator to wrestle with an emotional detachment from certain characters while also wrestling with his fractured identity. Okay? So perhaps in the same vein as the narrator's fractured identity in Fight Club, I found myself with a fractured identity as to where this quote comes from. Because without James' footnote, which cites the film, aka the performance, I, as a reader, could have potentially made the case that James is relying upon a preceding textual version. Right? While in this case, the performance and the textual tradition do not change drastically, the source from which James is drawing does imply a media relationship to that source, one that differs from the case that could be made by me, a reader, absent James' clarifying footnote. Right? So this leads me to a set of questions that we can consider. Does a reader need to know both references, both the text and the film Fight Club, to get what James is doing here? Does James need to know both the text and the reference to do what he does in the book? Even though the footnote clarifies where it comes from, that this comes from the performance, could we assume, me as a reader, assume that James had considered both the literate source and the performance, since both of these pre-exist your composition? Okay. Without the footnote, would it be obvious to the reader that James is referring to the performance instead of the novel? Right? The allusion implies a direct relationship with some preceding material, yet absent the footnote, could a compelling case be made by me, the reader, that either the novel or the performance were at play here, right? And so how can we as readers determine the direct media relationship of something 2,000 years ago if, even in a modern sense, this question shows up in your book, okay? Interestingly enough, as a side note, later in the book, you include another quote that has text and film, right? The Last Temptation of the Christ, in which your citation includes both of those things, right? And so you're referencing both mediums there. But these questions, when they're coupled with my skeptical or more complex, or however you want to term it, sense of writing processes in antiquity, they left for me a sufficient doubt as to the assurances of the writing process you've detailed here, and the textual relationships which are kind of assumed from that. And so with that, I'm going to cede the rest of my time. But thank you for that. And I'll James, I'll send you the list of those questions I asked at the end, so you can actually see a text of them. But thank you all for your time and consideration. I look forward to the conversation.
Zach, thanks so much. James, you got a lot of questions there to think about, and you have a few minutes over our break to think about. So I believe it's 1:07, so we're going to take a 5-minute break and look at that cat. Whoa. So we'll resume at 1:12 p.m. Eastern Time. So we'll see you back here shortly. Thank you all. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back, everyone. We're ready to begin part 2 of our Unbound book review. So what we're going to do, we're going to start off, we're going to give James the opportunity to respond to the panelists, and if possible, the panelists may want to respond to James's comments briefly. And then we'll open it up to our virtual audience out there. It looks like there may be a couple of questions in there already, I think. But so James, I'm going to turn it over to you to respond to Dan and Hugo and Zach's comments. So off to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And thanks to all three of you, the engagement with my work and just how thoroughly you know the work is means a lot to me, and it doesn't always go without saying, even when you read published reviews at times. And so I really truly appreciate how much time you've spent with the work and clearly thinking with it and thinking critically of it. It's exactly what I would hope for. And so that goes for all three of you. These are the provocative questions you've posed, and I will do my best to answer them briefly, but also try to leave as much time as I can for a broader discussion. Beginning with Dan, I appreciate two things very much right off the bat. One is that you went back to my earlier work on John's use of Matthew, which was my dissertation, and hopefully was rewritten. If you were to compare the dissertation side by side with the published book, you could tell that I rewrote it, but it still sounds very much like a technical discussion that's much more intended for specialists. And so highlighting that this book with Eerdmans, writing and rewriting the Gospels, was very much intended for a broader audience, and Hugo alluded to this too. Like, don't be deceived. It is still an academic work. It is breaking new ground, but it's also intentionally written. And this just happened over the course of writing the book, that I found myself really with the encouragement of a good friend of mine who's a senior editor at another press, saying, when you talk about this stuff, it makes perfect sense. You should just record yourself talking about it and write that, because that the tone, the pitch, everything about it is conveyed, and it makes sense. It's clear. Don't overcomplicate things. So that's what I tried to do, and it really helped me get over a hurdle of years of research. And if you've ever used Scrivener, it has its pros and cons. I had this sprawling Scrivener document of years of readings and rereadings of each gospel, and eventually when I sat down to write the book, I had to start with the blank screen in Microsoft Word and not even look at Scrivener. And then occasionally I would go back and I would find it. So and I appreciate saying that the pop culture references are helpful and they're entertaining, but they also make a point, because that was my point, is that I wanted them to not just to be some kind of flowery sideshow, but actually to bring home a point that was relatable. So I'm glad that those came across. I can appreciate that Dan is a Q holdout. I don't assume that we're all as Q skeptical as I, but if I wrote it down correctly, Dan posed the question of why Luke would reorder and rewrite, as I'm saying, if I'm not paying due attention to Q and Q scholarship. And I think that's a fair question. I think, though, with what I tried to do in the Synoptics, by using the trajectories from Mark to Matthew to Luke, is intentionally to say that we don't need Q in those moments. So if I can show it happening, to me, there's an undercurrent that just says, so why have Q? Why would Luke reorder and rewrite? It's an excellent question to ask of Luke regarding his use of Mark, because he reorders and he rewrites Mark. And I can't give enough praise to Greg Carey's article, Moving Things Ahead. And it's, along with Mark Goodacre's article on fatigue in the Synoptics, probably the two most frequently cited articles in my own research. It's the equivalent of Augustine's "The love of God shed abroad in our hearts by the Holy Spirit." It's like they're the ones I quote the most frequently. So knowing that Luke does this with Mark under any hypothesis then leads us to say an example that Zach brought up, the parable of the talents and the minas. I see Luke doing this with Mark and with Matthew. So for people who haven't read the book, what happens is, in the apocalyptic discourse, Mark has, as almost as an aside, to illustrate that the end could come at any moment, and in Mark it sounds like it's coming soon. And Mark says, well, it's like when a slave owner goes away and he leaves the enslaved people in charge. And Mark's point is, now he's coming back, and you have to give account for what you did in his absence. And Matthew takes that and turns that one-liner into a full-blown parable. Once upon a time, a slave owner went away. He left these enslaved people in charge of his estate, and he gave them these amounts. And but then Matthew adds one word that it's a couple of letters, 3 letters, but it's important to say that the slave owner goes away for a long time. And I highlight that because we're so accustomed to Hans Conzelmann's famous work, foundational work of redaction criticism, theology of the Gospels, St. Luke, at least in English, or Die Mitte der Zeit in German. But Luke's delay of the parousia, that Luke is constantly, it's a redactional tendency to make the end of the world and final judgment being cast farther and farther into the future. And I just interject that Matthew's already delaying the parousia, because in Mark, that one-liner about the slave owner going away and coming back sounds like he's about to come back. And when Matthew turns it into a full-blown parable, he begins by saying he's going away for a long time. So why does Luke relocate that? Because Luke tells you, the narrator tells you explicitly, before they got to Jerusalem, not part of the apocalyptic discourse right before we have Last Supper, before they even entered into Jerusalem, Jesus told this parable because some of them thought that the kingdom was about to appear immediately. And he wanted them to be prepared to wait a long time. And so he takes this and he rewrites it. Why does he relocate it? He tells you why he relocates it. So, because people thought it was going to happen soon. And so Matthew's one qualification that the slave owner is going away for a long time didn't do enough, apparently, to dispel the notion that the end was still coming soon. So Luke further delays the parousia. There I see that we have to have rewriting. And if you go to the critical edition of Q and you get to that parable, it's because it's in Matthew and it's Luke and it's similar enough. You have the critical edition of Q saying, well, it's the talents or it's minus, and it's the the last slave or the third slave, and the way that they're numbered and the differences among them. It's quite a jumbled mess in terms of saying we don't know what Q actually said. But either Matthew rewrote Q or Luke rewrote Q, whichever Matthew or Luke more faithfully represented whatever the Q version of the parable was. Well, that to me is one of the biggest faults with the Q hypothesis, that either Matthew or Luke constantly has to be rewriting Q. And to me, I would rather risk the oversimplification of saying Luke has rewritten Matthew than to say at various times Matthew or Luke is rewriting Q, because they're not the same when they tell the same thing that occurs only in Matthew and Luke. And quickly, also, Dan highlighted that I talk about Acts of Thomas. That was something I brought up at one of these CBA meetings on the continuing seminar on John. And when I first used this as an example of oppositio in imitando, you can read the book where I talk about it. But the Acts of Thomas takes this the parable of the rich man and Lazarus and completely rewrites it. So the characters in the parable become real people, and a brother actually dies and goes to the heavens and is able to come back from the dead to warn his brother that there is this heavenly kingdom full of palaces, and that is how the folks in India become Christians due to the work and ministry of the Apostle Thomas. It is a radical rewriting of that parable, and I was fortunate in that seminar to have Harold Attridge, who had written about Acts of Thomas and that section of it as a way of reworking what Matthew says about storing up for yourselves treasures in heaven. And so I footnoted his article, but then I gave my example of how it's a rewriting of Luke. And I was able to ask him, do you buy this? Before, since it's now a conference paper that I've circulated in advance to this seminar, before I put it in the book. And he said, yes, I think that was well put. Like that makes a lot of sense. You can explain why Luke would leave out certain details that would not make sense once he relocates the setting to India. You can't, for example, have Luke saying, your brothers have the law and the prophets, so they already know what to do. Well, so of course you would leave that out of Acts of Thomas because it makes no sense in its new context. And so Dan asked, are there criteria for this, the snowballing and the oppositio in imitando? And he rightly alluded to Richard Hayes, who's Echoes and Allusions in Paul. How does Paul use the Old Testament? And I would say, yes, that's what I'm trying to do here. And I probably could have been more explicit about it, but it is that density or volume criterion that Hayes has that I have in mind. So when Acts of Thomas rewrites the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, you have a dead brother. And you have someone who comes back from the dead, and you have this notion of whether that then convinces people that they should believe or not. There's an accumulation, and it's admittedly subjective of where you cross that line, but I think that is my working assumption in terms of saying somebody's rewriting this. We have to have a certain number that satisfies our curiosity to say enough elements are in play that it makes sense to see these in conversation with each other and not as independent. So we can come back to that if I've not given adequate attention to it. For Hugo, I guess I owe you a cut of my royalties, and I appreciate the praise for the book. I appreciate our friendship very much, but I also know that we're both very similar, that we can be friends and we can still disagree with people. And so when we give praise, it's because we think it's deserved. And so it truly means the world to me that you would say such glowing things about the book. And I appreciate for Dan and Hugo the attention to my work on ancient writing materials, because that's really where, to me, it all begins. It's where the Gospels come from. It's where any piece of ancient writing comes from. I don't think there's been enough attention paid to it. And as Hugo mentioned, when people do it, they have a lot of really bad misconceptions and mischaracterizations of the media themselves that need to be dispelled so that we can have the proper starting point. I also appreciate that Hugo highlighted my connection to Paul. It's the last thing I expected in writing this book. And I say at the conclusion of the book, Paul becomes this sort of creepy figure who's just lurking in all the corners. And I kept finding him in the Gospels in places that I wasn't looking for him. And so I didn't set out to write a chapter on Christology. And I didn't set out to see all the Gospels as working with Paul, but it's where the data took me. And for a long while, it's just where it dragged me. And I finally think that I wrestled it down enough to say there are these different levels of familiarity with Paul. And I really do think that is the question. As Hugo put it, my book ends with a comma for where we go from here. I think trying to figure out how much of the Pauline corpus is at play in the work of each of the evangelists is really the question for gospel scholarship, because I don't think that any of them are ignorant of some of Paul's works. The question is how many are at play, and that creator Christology. Is it Colossians to John to Hebrews? Is it Hebrews to Colossians to John? Is it John to... I spun that out I could make an argument for every possible one, and I admit that I haven't solved it. And so I leave the question open because I hope that others will take it up and run with it. Hugo asked about non-canonical gospels, and that's a great question, and it is one that I've thought about. If you think about Protevangelium of James or the Infancy Gospel of James, you clearly have knowledge of Matthew and Luke, and that text, and Mark Goodacre has a great essay on this in an edited volume by Francis Watson and Sarah Parkhouse on Beyond the Canonical and Non-Canonical Divide is I think the subtitle of the book. Clearly Matthew and Luke are at play, but when the good teacher recognizes that Jesus isn't like every other kid, that's very Johannine as well. And so I think that you can and should have these lines of these trajectories continuing on outside of the canon. And that is the approach that I take. Interestingly, I love the fragment we have of the harmonization of Jesus's baptism in the so-called Gospel of the Ebionites that Epiphanius has preserved, because it is really exquisite as a harmonization, but it's only of the Synoptics, and it is devoid of any seeming Johannine influence. And for the record, I am fully on board with Chuck Hill's great work and his dispelling of the myth of Orthodox Johannophobia. So I don't think that the early Orthodox were afraid of the Gospel of John or any of that. I do just think that when we see that baptism scene in the Gospel of the Ebionites, it's only the Synoptics that are being harmonized, and they're being brilliantly harmonized, but we don't see any influence of John there. So you can see those trajectories. The same with the Gospel of Thomas. Mark Goodacre, Simon Gathercole also, and John Meyer's essays, as Chris Skinner always reminds us of, are too overlooked. But Mark Goodacre's book in particular on Thomas and the Gospels shows you that Thomas has Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but you don't see any John in Thomas. So I do think we should keep spinning out trajectories and see where they go. I do think that the canonical ones come first, and certainly for the church, why the church will continue to privilege the canonical over the non-canonical, but in scholarship, I don't want to de-emphasize the extra canonical gospels at all. And the clearest example for me is all my work on Tatian, that he's got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we see those trajectories continuing there. Hugo asks, how, and not so much the how, but why does John use as little or as much of the Synoptics? And I think that's a great question. But as I've mentioned with Gospel of Thomas, half of it comes from the Synoptics, but it's not close to half of the Synoptics, right? It's a very small sample size that Thomas is working with. And I think if we connect those two questions of the non-canonical trajectories and why use as little or much as you want, it's an open question, but it's John, back to Moody Smith, asking if John is the first apocryphal gospel, at least in a sense. That being highly selective and leaving out so much of what you know from Matthew, Mark, and Luke is the turn that we see with all the subsequent gospels, or the non-canonical gospels. And I do think it's right to see John using that he uses at least 20% of the Synoptics is considerable. If you go to things like Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Judas, that have nowhere near the parallels, and yet are evidently influenced, particularly by John. So I think that's a question for scholarship to take up. But even using something like the feeding of the 5,000, John is faithful to it, but also rewriting it, right? That you have the disciples seemingly, I like to imagine it as a musical, that they're singing in unison where they shall find food for so many people. And John, as is typical of John, assigns individual speaking parts. Just as he identifies Judas as the one who was complaining about the cost of the ointment, Jesus has a dialogue with Philip and Andrew, so we get all the material from the Synoptics, but we don't have the disciples speaking in unison. So we see these changes, and we also see that it's Eucharistic, that it's followed by the entire Bread of Life discourse, and it's not an accident that John is the only one who says, and it was about time for Passover. And I think there we see supersessionism raising its ugly head, but that is what John has in mind, that the Eucharist is going to supersede Passover. And I think that is John's intent. So, why pick out the feeding of the 5,000? And because it's so perfect to fit John's agenda of supersessionism. No matter how critical I am of supersessionism from my privileged, contemporary 21st century knowledge, I think that that's part of John's agenda. And so I do think that we can at times understand why he would pick what he picked and why he would rewrite it the way he would rewrite it. He then doesn't need a Last Supper to be Eucharistic because he's already got that covered back in chapter 6 and with the ensuing Bread of Life discourse. So finally, with Zach, I appreciate having the pushback. I'm guilty as charged when it comes to oversimplifying things. I have no shame in making that plea because I think that so much of previous scholarship is too overcomplicated. And so I intentionally tried to simplify it as much as I could, even if that means pushing more than folks want. And I love that you appreciate the Fight Club reference. I actually had to plead with the editors to keep in that reference. I am Luke's complete lack of surprise. It was maybe my favorite section of the book to write. It sort of wrote itself and was deeply indebted to Greg Carey's work on moving things ahead. Why does Luke move ahead the anointing? Well, one thing that happens right after the anointing in Luke is that Luke introduces all the women who were following Jesus the entire time from the Galilee, starting with Mary Magdalene, etc. Why say that? Because in Matthew and in Mark, you have the women who followed Jesus all the way from Galilee who are there at the cross after the disciples have fled. And every reader should just be shocked. Like, what? What women? There were women there the whole time? And if you're making a Jesus film, you got to account for stuff like this. And this is what Luke does. He kind of thinks cinematically to be anachronistic. And he's saying, I need to adduce the fact that there were women there the whole time. And so I'll do that early. And once you saw that one, you see all these other places. Why is there a sword fight? Luke is stuck with a sword fight and a guy gets his ear cut off. And so it's the famous saying, if you have a gun shown in Act 1, it needs to go off by Act 3, right? So Luke has Jesus say, hey, do we have any swords? We've got 2 swords. Okay, better bring them. And you're thinking, okay, it's about to go down, right? And so that's what happens. And you see this as a tendency that Luke has. But Zach said, is that text or is it performance? And I appreciate the way Zach is doing performance criticism because I think it's better than what's been done before and much more likely for me to engage with. But I would push back on calling the film Fight Club a performance. And I would say, in contemporary terms, it is much more like a text. A performance, if I think of it as a play or as something where actors who know each other well might be free to go off script and on any given night, depending on the audience, that's what I think of when I think performance. And when I think cinematically, I think you might have however many takes, but there's one that makes it into the final version of the film, and everything else is on the cutting room floor in the process of editing. So when I say, I cite I am Jack's complete lack of surprise, the narrator, parentheses, Edward Norton, that I'm alluding to the film. And I can see how, well, sure, there's the novel and there's the film. But to me, that film is not a performance. It was a performance at the moment that it was being filmed in many takes. But once it gets edited, for me, it is much more like a text because I can rewatch it and rewind it and find the exact moment and give you a timestamp of when that is uttered in the film. And so that to me is much more textual. So I think it interestingly blurs those lines between text and performance, and I would say it's not as much a performance. And similarly, I don't think Luke knows a performant Matthew. I begin when I talk about a lot about Quintilian, who tells us a lot about how books were written, and he talks about how hard it is to remember things and to remember things verbatim, and that it's so much harder to memorize prose than poetry, uh, because poetry can at least rhyme or have a meter. But even when he's memorizing poetry, he writes it down and he recites it repeatedly, and that's how things got remembered. And that's where I find a problem with a lot of what performance criticism has done. I think there's too quick of a leap to say, oh, they saw it and, heard it and remembered it. And I think of the way I interact with Fight Club. I haven't just seen it once. I've seen it multiple times, and I can go back and look it up to make sure I'm getting the quote right. And so I think that it's a lot more difficult than a lot of performance critics let on to have memory functioning in that way when we have Quintilian, who can recite Virgil's eclogues from memory because he wrote them down and read them repeatedly, because he tells you how he memorized things. I don't think that's what we're seeing when we think about, well, maybe the evangelists or maybe the Gospels were being read and recited and then remembered and recast. To me, the model breaks down based on what the greatest ancient rhetorician tells us, and who shows us what an excellent memory he had and his skills of recollection. When he tells us he couldn't do that from one pass, then I'm skeptical that the Gospels were doing that. So, does the reader need to know both? No. Ultimately, for John, what this means, and I said this maybe a lot more in John's use of Matthew than I did in the current book, John is intentionally written so that his can be the only Jesus book you've ever read. And so it stands on its own, but it does not stand alone, because John could not have been written without Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And if we think of Richard Bauckham saying, writing his essay, John for readers of Mark, right? A lot of John makes a lot more sense to those readers who can compare it to the Gospels. But those other Gospels are not a prerequisite for reading John. And I would argue the same for any of the others that came before it. Luke's preface tells you he's working with multiple sources, and Luke makes more sense if you read it in light of Matthew and Mark, but you don't have to. I have students who, even though we're in the Bible Belt, did not grow up reading the Bible, and so they can start with any gospel, and they're like, "Wow, if it's a synoptic gospel, there were a lot of demons, weren't there?" And I think, yeah, that's a question you should ask. And then you get to John, and you say, "Where are all the demons?" Right? Because John has left this out, and that ties into what I did in the Christology chapter. I think John's lack of exorcisms is intentional, because it's the demons in Matthew, Mark, and Luke who most frequently recognize Jesus as the Son of God. John has a problem with that, so he has a whole lot of humans calling Jesus the Son of God, and they know that he is a different kind of Son of God than angels or demons, as they're called in the Septuagint. He is the only begotten Son of God, who has to be superior to them because he, in fact, created all things that exist, including those lesser divine beings. So I will stop there. I hope that is enough of an interaction with folks. Again, I thank Dan and Hugo and Zach for their thoughtful engagement, and look forward to the time we have left to talk further.
Thank you, James. So we have about 15 minutes left, so I'm going to give brief time to the panelists to respond if they wish. If not, we can move. We have a couple of questions in the chat, but if y'all have something you'd like to say back to James, feel free at this point.
James, I think you're right in terms of how modern film becomes textualized, right? Because we can't fast forward and rewind, and so I think that's an absolutely right thing. I would still say though, because it differs, there is still, if it's not performance, what is it? Iteration? Is it rewriting? Like, what is that change? And again, the Fight Club example is a really small one, but the example that I was thinking about the other day was that I was talking about Jurassic Park with one of my students the other day, right? And for them, that only exists as film. But for me, the first thing I think about Jurassic Park is the book, because that was the first experience I had of that at that thing. So what does it mean that we can both talk about Jurassic Park, but have two completely different notions of what that is in that conversation, right? There is still some difference between those as sources, right? And so, I don't know how to, I get what you're saying, but I also want to say there is something different about them, and how do we account for those differences? And this is a much larger conversation but I just wanted to
I would say briefly, I think that a film adaptation of a book is a different kind of thing. It's absolutely analogous. We compare things, as Jonathan Z. Smith told us. If they're identical, we don't compare them. You can compare apples to oranges, right? So I do think we can compare these things, but I do think a film adaptation of a novel is different. I started with Pinocchio, and that's where I think that book, the Disney version, what Guillermo del Toro does, I think that's much more analogous, closely analogous to the Gospels, because they're going in different directions where they're more readily discernible, like distinguishable. I mean, and where I would say, the Michael Crichton novel and the film version. Yes, there are differences. To anyone who's ever read the book and then watches the film, that's not how you envision those characters in your mind, right? So we know but I would say they're like this close. Where I think when we look at the Pinocchio spinoffs, they're like this. They're all related, but they're more freely rewritten, and that's what I see going on, particularly when it comes to John. And I would be remiss not to say that the first two rules of Fight Club, as you should know, are that we don't talk about Fight Club.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think I agree with you in that where we're going with this. But I also would say, like, even Pinocchio, though, right? That progression. My 9-year-old can watch the Disney version without presuming the textual iteration before, or God forbid, I'm not going to let her watch Del Toro's till she's a little older because of her. She's emotionally attached. But like each of those iterations, they stand on their own. But there's also I would still call those performances. That there's some core, there's some thing that is the Pinocchio narrative, and that you can say that it exists outside of its relationship to a prior textual thing and still call it Pinocchio. Like, my daughter can still call it Pinocchio without knowing the textual thing before it. And as the reason I wanted to bring this up is that I actually think there's more freedom in knowing it as performance than text, because of our modern ideas of how texts work. That we and I know that you're trying to reorient this towards ancient texts, that they're piecing things together, and I think you're right about this. And I do want to be really clear. I think your work on that provides a whole lot of helpful nuance to the ways we think about ancient writing practice, because a lot of performance critics are guilty of of oversimplifying that, or having distorted versions of what's going on in that writing process.
Yeah.
And so I want to be absolutely clear that I appreciate the nuance you're including in that.
And if you think of Josephus, right, when he gives a different version of what Samuel King say and what the chronicler said,
Right.
And we know that he knows both of those texts.
Right.
We also have the historical knowledge to know that he's 1,000 years later. He does not have some oral tradition, right?
No.
He's now the gospel writers. Your point is well made. Like, they are in much closer proximity when we're talking decades to Jesus to say, sure, orality can still be in play. I just have trouble, pinning down what orality could be. But so when I look at Josephus creatively rewriting something and offering a different account and a different order of events, and thinking that he can improve upon his sources, but never for a second thinking he can replace them, that's what I want to say each of the subsequent evangelists were doing. I want to dispel the notion of replacement, that anybody wrote a gospel to say, read mine, not the others, whether that be a synoptist or John or a non-canonical, gospel writer. And so that's the work I'm trying to do. And so when I say, can stand on its own, but not stand alone, the author cannot have written it without having read the others. But knowledge of all those sources is not prerequisite to the readers. But there are book collectors who would say, I see what you did there. And I see that a lot with Tatian. When Tatian can drop in, I said in one publication, Tatian extracts Marken Sondergut, the stuff that's only in Mark, tiny little bits of it, with surgical precision. And if you know, like I know the Gospels, you say, I see what you did there. And it can be a phrase within a sentence, within a much more broadly harmonized thing. You say, this is a writer who has such command of these texts, but can't write them independent of them in textualized form. And the reader doesn't have to catch that, a throwaway mark and line. It'll go right over the heads of a lot of folks, but to the really advanced reader, they're going to say, that's a good one. I like that. If it's something like the nickname Sons of Thunder, I imagine James and John as tag team wrestlers, akin to the Road Warriors back in my day, the Sons of Thunder, but he'll drop that in. You only get that from Mark, right? But he's got it and he's going to include it. But you don't have to know that to read it and say, okay, they had that nickname, whatever, moving on.
Okay, we have two questions in the chat that Josh is going to read out, just so we give the virtual people an opportunity to chime in. So, Josh?
Thank you very much. I have added some commentary in this to smooth out the language, but if you'd like the full questions, they are in the chat. Neil writes, I haven't read this book yet, but it sounds exciting. Two questions. Does Snowball bias interpreters towards accumulation? An author could also exclude or abbreviate, as in Markan posteriority, correct? And two, is our inertia around oral tradition owing to a longing for theological loyalty or consistency in sources? That's the first question. I'll read out the second one as well. Kathy writes, in the snowballing trajectory model of gospel development, the dating of texts is critical. What approximate dating is assigned to each of the gospels? So, James, I offer those up for you, but I welcome the other panelists to chime in as well.
No, and thanks very much. With Kathy's question, I appreciate that. I do say early in my book, I date all four canonical gospels roughly between 70 and 110. I think that 40-year window is a narrow one, not a wide one. I am critical of scholarship that thinks that the Gospels had to be written in these neat 10-year increments. I show examples where you could have rapid proliferation of more than four texts that are highly similar in less than a few years. And you can also have gaps of decades. So we shouldn't pretend like we know the spacing of them. But I say after 70 because I think the temple has been destroyed. I think that the apocalyptic discourse in the Synoptics and John's the Samaritan woman discussion, there will be a time when you worship neither here nor there. I think is a nod that the temple's gone. So I think all four are written after the year 70. Doesn't mean they can't have things that Jesus actually says. I just don't think anybody wrote them down until after 70. And I roughly use 110 because I think Ignatius of Antioch around that time has his letters give us ample evidence that he has the text of Matthew, Luke, and John. And for me, that entails that Mark had been written first. So I would say they're written within that time frame. And then in the book, I try to explain why I think it goes from Matthew to from Mark to Matthew to Luke to John. And that gets us back to the earlier question of what about Mark being written last of the Synoptics anyway, I assume. And I studied as an undergrad under Dave Dungan, who was a Griesbachian, and I have a great fondness for that school of thought that, to me, really kept a flag planted for Q skepticism until the Farrer hypothesis came along and gained more momentum. But so I wouldn't rule that out. Yes, texts can abbreviate. And I think that John is abbreviating 80% of the synoptics. I don't think that Mark is abbreviating Matthew and Luke. I think that there's plenty of evidence of why we think Mark has to come first. Mark Goodacre's chapter in dispensing with Q. Sorry, that's the Farrer article. The case against Q. It says let's start with Mark in priority and establishing it. I think there are plenty of good resources for saying Mark did have to come first, but in general, yes, absolutely, a later author doesn't just accumulate. There are times when there's an abundance of accumulation, and I have my Judas as my Johannine snowman, and he has to have all those previous elements. But to make room for the new things you're going to add, that means you have to leave a whole lot of things out. We can see Luke doing this with the great omission. We can see Matthew doing this by condensing Markan stories. They're always longer in Mark, so that Matthew can make room for all the material he's going to intersperse the teachings, like the Sermon on the Mount, etc. So yeah, it doesn't only mean accumulation. I just want to show the snowballing and the accumulation where I found it, to say if we can see it going from Mark to Matthew to Luke to John, then we don't need hypothetical sources and we don't need hypothetical compositional stages. The bit about oral tradition, I always refer readers to Robin Walsh's work. Her book on the origins of early Christian literature is phenomenal, and I've said in other contexts that she and I sort of share a brain. Our skepticism toward oral tradition is deep and profound and guiding. There's a lot of romanticism that Walsh shows in her work, specifically like the work of the German Romantics and the way those philosophical ideas shaped New Testament scholarship to go searching for oral tradition and make very strong claims about oral tradition, and that anything could be pulled from everywhere. And I just find it deeply unsettling. And again, I'll put in a plug for Mark Goodacre's The Fourth Synoptic Gospel. He has a beautiful section early in the book talking about how fluid the metaphor is for orality, and how that is problematic. So yeah, there's a lot going on with oral tradition. Some of it probably is theologically driven, that we really want the viva vox, right, of Jesus, and we want to get right back to him, that we want to have him teaching the Lord's Prayer. But then we've got a different Lord's Prayer in Matthew and Luke. So did people remember that being performed differently, or did somebody have to alter Q? And I just want to say, let's go with the Gospels that we have, and when we can find simple snowballs, let's use those. And then it's up to the reader to decide whether there's enough of a cumulative case to say, this makes sense, or, I'm still not satisfied. I still want compositional stages that are hypothetical, and I still want oral tradition, which is hypothetical, and I still want Q, which is hypothetical, or I want a signs source for John, which is hypothetical. And you can have them all if you want them. I don't want them. I don't need them. I don't find them useful. They are tools that break in my hand when I try to use them, and so I gave up using them. And my Bosch router does a much better job as a tool for me to make wax tablets and get back to ancient writing. And then it all sort of fell into place for me.
Great, thank you, James. I'm afraid we're gonna have to end it there. First, let me announce a couple of things coming up. We have the next Unbound Book Review will be on November 12th from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. with Crispin Fletcher Louis and his book, The Divine Heart Set, followed in January, on January 14th, Kevin McGrudden's A New Living Way, Christ in the Letter to the Hebrews. That is a tentative date. So please watch out in the CBA newsletter for confirmation of those. They will be coming up, and we have a full schedule coming up next year of UBRs. So if you have a new book coming out next year, please contact Joshua or myself, and we'll take a look at it and see what we can do about getting it in on a UBR. But we want to thank James and Dan and Hugo and Zechariah for being a part of this great conversation today. And again, the book was Writing and Rewriting the Gospels, John and the Synoptics, published by Eerdmans in January 2025, I believe it was. So it is available on, of course, Amazon, that beast that we all have to bear, unfortunately. But thank you all. James, thank you for writing the book. It's a fantastic piece, and as our panelists said, it's something that's going to be there for future gospel studies and, of course, for the study of John's gospel. Thank you all for the work that you did, and great round of applause for all of you. And it was a great conversation, and thank you all for being here, and it was an honor to have you. And thank you so much. Thank you for our virtual audience as well for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you at the next Unbound Book Review. Thank you so much.